The Anti-Imperialism of Fools, a cautionary story of the revolutionary socialist vanguard of England's post-9/11 anti-war movement, by Camila Bassi. Preface. The day after 9/11, I attended a local Socialist Alliance Committee meeting in Sheffield, England. As a representative of the revolutionary socialist organization, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. The Socialist Workers' Party comrades present discussed the 9/11 attack as regrettable in terms of the loss of life, but as nonetheless understandable. The SWP acknowledged the attack as tactically misguided, yet refused, when pressed to do so, to condemn it. Later in November 2001, at a public meeting at the Sheffield Socialist Alliance, I shared a platform with a then National Committee member of the Socialist Workers' Party to debate the US and UK war in Afghanistan. Besides from agreeing on opposition to the imperialist war onslaught, I was alone on the platform in raising opposition to the Islamist Taliban rule, and in arguing for labor movement solidarity with forces such as the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, RAWA, which resists both imperialism and Islamism and demand a progressive, democratic, secular alternative. The Socialist Worker Party comrades present, both on the platform and from the floor, alleged a political error on my part and those who argued along with me. Their rationale was that, to fully oppose the war on terror, we had a duty to oppose the main enemy and the greater evil, the UK and US imperialism, and this alone. Anything else, they argued, would alienate the masses of disillusioned, angry British Muslim youth that socialists needed to win over. The Socialist Workers' Party's dual camp of, quote, my enemy's enemy is my friend, a socialistic inversion of imperialist war discourse of the status quo versus regression, came to dominate England's anti-war movement. They publicly launched their initiative Stop the War Coalition 10 days after 9/11, with the aim of mobilizing a broad political grouping against the war on terror. Since then, the Socialist Workers' Party vanguard of the Stop the War Coalition has, at critical moments, steered the political course that England's anti-war protests have taken. Introduction. Neither inverted dual camps nor point zeros. During wartime, major imperialist powers typically impose a geopolitical choice between the status quo and regression, or the civilized and the barbaric. The consequences of this bourgeois dual camp is that its fetishism, including in its leftist inversion, diverts from the indispensable task of organizing a third independent force or camp, of politics by and for the collective interest of workers worldwide. The war on terror is pitched by its leading imperialist advocates as a battle of us versus them, or good versus evil, while in an inverted dual camp, 9/11 and later Islamist acts of terrorism are conceptualized by sections of the left as inevitable products of a greater imperialist terrorism, and a reflection of wider struggles between David and Goliath. This in turn lends itself to the conclusion that such products and struggles form part of an anti-imperialist resistance, necessitating albeit qualified alliance against the prime enemy. It is this conclusion, in relation to the case of a revolutionary socialist vanguard of an anti-war movement in the West, that this paper identifies as problematic. I do so not by orienting to post-Marxist left analysis, but by returning to the spirit of Marxism. In brief, this paper draws upon the tradition of third camp revolutionary socialists during wartime in order to critique the blind alley inverted dual campism dominating leftist anti-war resistance during the War on Terror. This tradition is to develop the independent political agency of workers internationally, as a class capable of self-government in their struggles against capitalism and its reactionary products, and to assess, by and for this class's advancement, the upshot of the actual politics flowing from these struggles and products. In the simplest terms, the rudimentary foundation of the third camp is, quote, nothing but the camp of workers and oppressed peoples everywhere who are sick to death of insecurity, exploitation, subjection, and increasingly abominable wars, who aspire to freedom, peace, and equality, end quote, independent of their ruling class and their ruling class's reactionary enemies. Schachtman. The absence of third camp politics is apparent in prominent leftist academic and public intellectual commentary on 9/11 and the War on Terror. In the aftermath of 9/11, Watts, for instance, observed a, quote, confusion mixed with revulsion within the ranks of the left. Quote, the reluctance to admit, quote, they had it coming, end quote, the whispered moral equivalences of casualties, what of Rwanda or the Palestinian intifada, and a sort of deep schizophrenia, end quote. Quote, was this not a strike in the name of modern anti-imperialism? Or was it grounds for a, quote, just war? Was this not a piece with the anti-globalization movement, end quote? Yet who could endorse Islamism? It's a really messy organization of these quotes. It's very visually unpleasing to look at if you're wondering what my experience is right now. Couldn't really follow what the hell was going on there. Anyway, Chomsky, while denouncing 9/11, defines 9/11's uniqueness in the fact that, unlike any other point in U.S. foreign imperialist venture or European colonial history, the victim struck back at the very heart of the imperialist power, directing, quote, the guns the other way, end quote. More to the point, 9/11 was a cumulative result of U.S. foreign policy and proved that industrial powers no longer had the monopoly on violence. Chomsky, 2003-2002. In an article for Le Monde just 2 months after 9/11, Baudrillard remarks that the events represented, quote, the purest type of defiance, end quote, and, quote, could be forgiven, end quote, since, quote, in dealing all the cards to itself, the system forced the other to change the rules of the game, and the new rules are ferocious, because the game is ferocious. All those singularities, species, individuals, cultures, which have paid with their deaths for the establishment of a global system of commerce ruled by a single power, avenge themselves by transferring the situation to terrorism, end quote. Baudrillard. During the U.S. invasion of Najaf in 2004, Klein tactically defends the Shiite Islamist Muqtada al-Sadr and his Mahdi army, despite recognizing the politics of the Mahdi army that, if ever to come to power, would attempt an Iranian-type theocracy. Klein's reasoning is that, for the moment, the Mahdi army represents something in common with the Iraqi population, opposition to the imperialist occupation of Iraq. In a plenary of an anti-war teach-in at Berkeley, Butler comments, quote, understanding Hamas, Hezbollah, as social movements that are progressive, that are on the left, that are part of the global left, is extremely important. That does not stop us from being critical of certain dimensions of both movements. It doesn't stop those of us who are interested in nonviolent politics from raising the question of whether there are other options besides violence. So again, a critical, important engagement should be entered into the conversation on the left, end quote. Judith Butler. The signatories of an anti-war statement released during the 2006 Israeli war in Lebanon offers, quote, solidarity and support to the victims of the brutality in Lebanon and Palestine and to those who mount a resistance against it, end quote. By implication, then, political support to Hezbollah and Hamas. These signatories include Socialist Workers' Party members, Alex Kalinikos, Lindsey German, Chris Bambury, and John Rees, and leftist academics and public intellectuals, Gilbert Achkar, Tariq Ali, Francis Berga, Judith Butler, Noam Chomsky, Ilan Papa, Harold Pinter, Tanya Reinhardt, Stephen Rose, Hillary Rose, Arundhati Roy, and Howard Zinn, for example. While Achkar cautions against the Socialist Workers' Party's alliance with the Muslim Association of Britain in England's anti-war movement, an organization with political links to Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, Achkar nonetheless frames a struggle, quote, between the Islamic fundamentalist David and the U.S. imperialist Goliath, end quote. Achkar. Specifically, the, quote, demon of U.S. imperialism, which has produced and fed the monster of Islamic fundamentalism for its own interests, now finds itself vulnerable because, quote, the demon ultimately turned against the demiurge. And so, as on 9/11, the monster is hitting back. Achkar. I don't want to misrepresent Achkar, so let me read that again. I think I didn't say when the quote ended. Specifically, the, quote, demon, end quote, of U.S. imperialism, which has produced and fed the, quote, monster, unquote, of Islamic fundamentalism for its own interests, now finds itself vulnerable because, quote, the demon ultimately turned against the demiurge, end quote. And so, as on 9/11, the monster is hitting back. Achkar concludes that in the battle between two barbarisms, the prime culpability lies with the greater heavyweight barbarism. Crucially, Achkar fails to exhibit a politically independent progressive democratic alternative to both imperialism and imperialism's reactionary enemies. Indeed, this is a symptomatic failure of all of the aforementioned commentary. Closer to the disciplinary home, prominent Marxist and post-Marxist public intellectual geographers fall short of mapping out an anti-imperialist resistance in the spirit of the third camp. As Kostry remarks of Smith's The Endgame of Globalization, if one thing is missing, it's a discussion of progressive forms of opposition within and without the American state apparatus. End quote. Harvey's The New Imperialism offers brief mention of the daunting challenges faced by an anti-war and anti-imperialist movement in the United States, and notes a rising tide of global resistance to neoliberalism, yet stops short of discussing a third camp grounded in the struggles of labor movements worldwide. This stopgap is perhaps the result of what Smith highlights as Harvey's break from being an advocate of revolutionary theory to that of being, quote, a subversive agent, a fifth colonist inside the system, with one foot firmly planted in some alternative camp, end quote. O'Tautau questions whether, quote, the world of hard political choices, end quote, is avoided by Gregory in the colonial present, with his abstraction from the issue of what an anti-colonial geopolitics would and should actually look like. On the insurgency violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine, Gallagher queries of Gregory, are these, quote, forms of resistance, end quote, and if so, quote, what are we to make of their political content, end quote. A demurring Gregory, she observes, evades the question of whether the left should support any of these resistances. Retorts afflicted powers, Castri also notes, neglects to assert the left's retorts afflicted powers, Castri also notes, neglects to assess the left's prospects in opposing capitalism and Islamism, and falls short of detailing their call for a non-vanguardist left international. In sum, he astutely cautions, quote, this sort of pessimism of the intellect and the will is as implausible as unalloyed optimism about the immediate future, end quote. Castri. As possible routes out of this impasse, Hindman proposes, quote, a third space, a feminist geopolitics that goes, quote, beyond the binaries of either or, here, there, us, them, end quote. Developing the work of critical geopolitics while avoiding, she argues, its deconstructive tendencies that are, quote, insufficient to generate change for building alternative futures, end quote. Hindman suggests such futures can be mapped via a multi-scalar exploration and knowledge production of the multiple identities, ways of seeing, and intervention during the War on Terror. But on the ultimate goal of dismantling and democratizing geopolitics, the question of what agency can deliver this remains unanswered. This is unsurprising, since Hindman's feminist geopolitics is an ethnographic rather than a strategic perspective, end quote, which, quote, does not promote an oppositional stance in relation to particular political principles or acts. The third space of neither nor, then, is not to be mistaken for the third camp. So, on the US and UK war in Afghanistan, Hindman remarks of the virtual impossibility of Afghan women until on the US and UK war in Afghanistan, Hindman remarks of the virtual invisibility of Afghan women until the Northern Alliance victory, in which media images of unveiled women played to Western notions of progress. What is missed, however, is reference to and political engagement with Rawa, which to date holds a position that occupies, but also goes beyond a third space, by representing a third camp alternative. Quote, the U.S. war on terrorism removed the Taliban regime in October 2001, but it has not removed religious fundamentalism. By reinstalling the warlords in power in Afghanistan, the U.S. administration is replacing one fundamentalist regime with another. Rawa believes that freedom and democracy can't be donated. It is the duty of a people of a country to fight and achieve these values. Today, Rawa's mission for women's rights is far from over, and we have to work hard for the establishment of an independent, free, democratic, and secular Afghanistan. End quote. Braun and Dish note of the note of a near impossibility in mobilizing for or against the war in Afghanistan when the mission was framed by its rightist advocates in leftist terms, as defending the rights of Afghan women against tyrannical patriarchy, and by its leftist opponents as simply an imperialist war about oil. For them, the binarism of either opposing the war or supporting the war in these terms can only be transcended by refusing the articulated discourses altogether, which predominate our understanding of political connections. The challenge, they state, lies in bringing the networks out of hiding that offer less prescriptive, more promising resistance. Featherstone, too, develops a networked approach to leftist anti-war resistance, specifically the imaginative internationalist politics of transnational networks, which provide a way out of the binarism that he ascribes in part to the 20th century Marxist left. For instance, Featherstone contests the nation-centeredness of the left throughout the Cold War, demonstrative in its doctrine of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, and its subsequent siding with the USSR. In particular, Featherstone's concern is that this left bypassed the, quote, more rhizomorphic, routed, and productive practices of solidarity, end quote, Featherstone, 2006, that were occurring during this time, which offered a less hierarchical, more imaginative internationalism, such as E.P. Thompson's involvement in the European campaign for nuclear disarmament during the 1980s that brought together political dissidents on both sides of the Cold War. However, in discussing the 20th century Marxist left, Featherstone omits third camp revolutionary socialists who during the Cold War agitated for an internationalist front of independent working class politics as a progressive socialist alternative to capitalism and Stalinism. On the War on Terror, Featherstone importantly cautions against both the left that sides with violent and anti-democratic forms of resistance to imperialism and the left that sides with so-called humanitarian imperialist intervention. Instead, Featherstone calls for a networked politics that transcends both. This work forms part of a wider post-Marxist relational or networked analysis, which, at its most critical end, is represented by inquiry into the geographies of solidarity and autonomism. Quote, geographies of solidarity and autonomism. Quote, spaces where people desire to constitute non-capitalist, egalitarian, and solidaristic forms of political, social, and economic organization through a combination of resistance and creation. End quote. From a third camp Marxist perspective, the strength of this analysis lies in its anti-Stalinism, its attention to everyday molecular but connected rebellions, which occur within but beyond capitalism, and its internationalism. There is nonetheless a critical departure from the politics of the third camp, rooted in the Italian autonomist Marxist redefinition of the working class during the 1970s. That is, a shift from the working class as the agency of revolutionary change, due to the specific relationship of wage labor to capital, to that of the, quote, socialized worker, or the, quote, multitude, which signifies imminent revolutionary forces evident in new figures of struggle and new subjectivities. In contradistinction, third camp Marxism politically centers its international solidarity work on class-based struggles and demands as the foundation of a united revolutionary front for workers and oppressed peoples everywhere. What, thus, is the contribution of this paper to critical geographical debate? The paper offers an indirect challenge to Amin and Thrift's demarcation of an old and relegated Marxist left against a new, present, and future agonistic, affective, and networked left. We have, they argue, arrived at a promising point zero. A left politics afresh that is free from dogmatic certainties and crude binarisms. Yet at point zero, as Smith warns us, is not 100 but 99 flowers that blossom. Yet at point zero, as Smith warns us, it is not 100 but 99 flowers that blossom, since, quote, Marxism is the one flower, end quote, in a means and thrift schema, quote, that should instead be choked in its bed, end quote. This paper also propounds a third camp Marxism distinct from Harvey's fifth column, which reflects, quote, the paradox of optimism amidst a resigned denial of revolution, end quote. From a wider trend noted by Castry of radical work infected with a pessimism of both the intellect and heart. Scattered throughout this paper are various quotes from activists and organizations beyond the West, resisting an imperialist war on terror, and an Islamist-based political substitute to this, while posing a democratic secular alternative. Their words and struggles indicate an actual basis to the third camp. The Marxism spirited in this paper recognizes the basic duty of socialists everywhere to develop labor movement-based solidarity with such forces, where and when they exist as part of the international and sovereign revolutionary offensive. In sum, this paper challenges both the point zero and inverted dual camp. In sum, this paper challenges both the point zero and the inverted dual camp. Its premise, using the case of the Socialist Workers' Party vanguard of the post-9/11 anti-war movement in England, is that of rediscovery of, not a retreat from, the spirit of Marxism offers a critical departure from the inversion of a bourgeois dual camp that subsequently sides with the enemy, i.e. Islamism, of the greater enemy of imperialism. As such, whilst there is a binary straitjacket of leftist anti-war resistance that post-Marxist critical accounts do well to shake off, this paper indirectly challenges the modification and refutation of Marxism and the subsequent demarcation of a point zero. I seek instead to advance an alternative current on Marxist interpretation. The third camp as opposed to an inverted dual camp in a modest attempt to rescue a political soul. The first section of this paper illustrates the third camp tradition as laid out in the key text of Hal Draper and Max Shachtman, written during the Cold War. Therefore, in the second section, the anti-war political resistance of the Socialist Workers' Party is explored, as profiled in their paper Socialist Worker, their magazine Socialist Review, and their periodical International Socialism Journal. Specifically, I examine their response to the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and 7/7, their support for the Islamist, quote, resistance to imperialism, end quote, in Iraq, Lebanon and Palestine, and the tenets which bolster their inverted dual camp. That is, their analysis of imperialism, anti-imperialism, and Islamism. In the third and final section, the broad, united front and wider project of anti-imperialism, pursued by the Socialist Workers' Party's vanguard of England's anti-war movement, is unraveled as, effectively, an evasion of politics in the spirit of the third camp. For this purpose, arguments made by Leon Trotsky on the nature of politics and the products of capitalism are drawn upon. The third camp. Perhaps the major exemplar of third camp politics during the last century was summed up in the slogan of the former US-based Workers' Party, later named the Independent Socialist League during the Cold War. Quote, neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism. End quote. Montgomery, 1998. Key writings of the two founding members of the former Revolutionary Socialist Workers' Party / Independent Socialist League, Hal Draper and Max Shachtman, contain a definitive elucidation of the third camp tradition. In an article written during the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, and originally printed in Socialist Leader, Socialist Leader is a journal. Socialist Leader, Shachtman defended the Independent Socialist League's opposition to both sides of the war against critics who argue that Stalinist totalitarianism is a far greater evil to the bourgeois democracy of the United States. For example, the former, unlike the latter, prohibits the existence of an independent labor movement, and since there was no actual mass movement against the two, the Independent Socialist League ought to back the U.S. The problem with this position, Shachtman reveals, is that it neglects to understand that Stalinism derives its social power by providing an anti-capitalist, albeit reactionary solution to the social problems of capitalism, which elsewhere are insolvable on a capitalist basis, and the official labor movement fails to deal with on a socialist basis. To understand the social power of Stalinism, then, it is essential that, quote, the labor movement throws off all responsibility for the politics of capitalism, its wars included, and leads the way out of the present blind alley of society with an independent program of socialist reconstruction, end quote. While, quote, we never promised that we would be able to organize them into an independent movement, packed, wrapped, sealed, and delivered by a specified date. We did say that unless they are organized into a movement independent of capitalism and Stalinism, the decay and disintegration of the world would continue as it has. We did say that the forces of the third camp of socialism and liberty are here, and it is our sworn duty to help organize them into an independent movement. End quote. Shachtman. Is it Shachtman or Shachtman? I'll just say Shachtman, and then someone can tell me how dumb I sound. Shachtman rebukes both leftist social democrats for having abandoned the third camp and struggle for socialism, thus offering critical support for American imperialism, and the Fourth International for failing to understand the third camp by placing Stalinism as part of the third camp. Whereas, Shachtman points out, as a basis on which to build, the millions of workers in India and Britain who defy both sides of the Cold War. In a debate between Hal Draper and the once third campus Ignazio Solon, originally printed in Labor Action during 1956, Solon defines the position of the third camp as a, quote, sophism of equidistance, end quote. That is, a point of political abstinence midway between two enemies falsely deemed equal in their political dangers. Again, this, Solon purports, fails to recognize and act upon the fact that Stalinism is the greater evil to Western imperialism, which must be critically supported. Draper retorts by directly quoting Solon's previous third camp position from an interview in 1939 on the question of the war waged by conservative bourgeois democracies against fascism, in order to point out its analogy with Stalinism. Quote, when the socialist, the best possible anti-fascist when the socialists, quote, Jesus Christ, quote, when the socialists, with the best possible anti-fascist, read anti-Stalinist intentions, renounce their own program, put their own theories in mothballs, and accept the negative positions of conservative democracy, they think they are doing their bit in the struggle to crush fascism, Stalinism. Actually, they leave to fascism, Stalinism, the distinction alone daring to bring forward in public certain problems, thus driving into the fascist Stalinist arms thousands of workers who do not accept the status quo, end quote. That's Salone. It is the duty of socialists, Draper insists, to resist the enforced dilemma of choosing between the status quo and regression, or one's ruling class and one's ruling class's enemy. But this does not consequently mean that socialists occupy a sophism of equidistance, or that socialists never choose one side over another while maintaining their political independence. See later the distinction between political and military support. Draper and Schachtman do not pretend that both sides in any given conflict are the same, but neither do they take individual conflicts, like the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, in isolation. They maintain that the fight against Stalinism can only be politically won by socialists mobilizing the labor movement within which they are active as part of an internationalist independent political alternative. For instance, Schachtman asserts that while a workers' government in the United States clearly, quote, cannot come tomorrow morning, end quote, it will never be a possibility until American workers decisively break from the capitalist class and their, quote, imperialist course, which poisons us with chauvinist ideas and alienates us from the peoples of other lands and people of other lands from us, end quote. Thus, as a practical basis for international workers' solidarity, Schachtman asserts, Thus, as a practical basis for international workers' solidarity, Schachtman asserts that the position of the American labor movement must be for a democratic foreign policy pillared by the unreserved right of all peoples and nations to self-determination. Ironically, by the 1960s, Schachtman himself abandoned third camp politics in favor of critical support for the Western imperialist war camp. Writing on the question of anti-imperialism and revolution, originally printed as a discussion guide for the Independent Socialist Club of Berkeley in 1968, Draper observes that a defeat for American imperialism abroad can have the objective effect of galvanizing opposition to American capitalism domestically, but this does not imply that socialists should, on this basis alone, politically support any opposing side on an imperialist-waged war. Why? Because one possible domestic outcome is not the only possible outcome. While a number of phenomena might aid revolutionary conditions domestically, such as hyperexploitation or recession, socialists plainly do not contend for these conditions. Instead, the decision to support anti-imperialist resistance must be based consistently on an assessment of what politics any given side in a war is a continuation of. For this reason, Draper spells out during war, socialists should not offer political solidarity to an organization or movement or government merely on the basis that it is an enemy of our enemy, or has widespread support, or is in or is likely to be in power, or formally adopts a political program ostensibly unobjectionable, or is successful in winning over more politically progressive elements than its leadership. The decision to offer political solidarity must be on the basis of what is analyzed as the, quote, real political character and real political program of its formation, end quote. Using the case of the Spanish Civil War, Draper also explains an important distinction between political support and military support. Draper explains that while revolutionary socialists militarily organized alongside a section of the bourgeois loyalist government against the Franco-led fascists, they maintained their political independence. He explains while revolutionary socialists militarily organized alongside a section of the bourgeois loyalist government against the Franco-led fascists, they maintained their political independence, which included lending no faith to the bourgeoisie as a trustworthy ally or an effective, sincere force against fascism. Their existence as politically independent third camp forces, in turn, offered a political alternative to both fascist and bourgeois status quo. Whereas, he cautions, the political and military collaboration that occurred between the Stalinist Communist Party and the Loyalist government turned into joint violent suppression of these independent left forces. The UK-based Socialist Workers' Party was once not adverse to these tenets. The former Third Camp slogan, quote, "neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism," end quote, was adopted in the late 1960s by the forerunner to the Socialist Workers' Party, the International Socialist. It was during the Iran-Iraq War that the International Socialist / Socialist Workers' Party first abandoned the Third Camp. From originally holding a stance that was against both sides in the conflict, for reasons that for Iran and Iraq, the war was being waged for regional imperialist interest, this changed in 1987. It was during the first Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988 that the Socialist Workers' Party first abandoned the Third Camp. From originally holding a stance that was against both sides in the conflict, for the reason that for Iran and Iraq, the war was being waged for regional imperialist interest. This changed in 1987. As a long-standing Socialist Workers' Party member retrospectively comments, quote, "I was back at college when the Iran-Iraq War began. A plague on the houses of both reactionary regimes, I thought. My view, though, began to change when it was becoming clear that the West was backing Iraq." End quote. Stack, 2003. The new standpoint was to politically support Iran in view of the fact that the United States was offering support to Iraq. Not because the politics of which the war was a continuation of, on the part of Iran, had suddenly become progressive. Iran today continues to be positioned by the Socialist Workers' Party as a regional bulwark against U.S. imperialist ambition. The post-9/11 anti-war politics of the Socialist Workers' Party. It is a mistake to think of the strategy of suicide. Quote, "It is a mistake to think of the strategy of suicide bombing as an irrationalism that derives from Islamic fundamentalism. There is a rationale for the adoption of this strategy that stems from the problem of defeating an enemy in conditions of extreme inequality of resources. What motivates them to action is rage at material conditions of oppression and exploitation." End quote. Jenkins, Socialist Workers' Party, 2006. Quote, "How can a political movement whose program is based on oppression, injustice, and discrimination possibly liberate people from oppression, injustice, and discrimination? Political Islam capitalizes on the discontent of people in its struggle for power. Those who see terrorism as the response of desperate, despairing people try to vindicate political Islam and say they, quote, understand political Islam's terrorism. While they refer to the injustices of the West and the necessity of struggle against it, they do not find it necessary to struggle against political Islam. There are two poles of terrorism in today's world which feed off each other. We cannot defeat one pole without curbing the other. End quote. Hamid, Worker Communist Party of Iraq, 2005. The aim of the Socialist Workers' Party initiated Stop the War Coalition was and remains officially, quote, very simple: to stop the war currently declared by the United States and its allies against, quote, terrorism. In 2003, the Stop the War Coalition co-organized, along with the Muslim Association of Britain and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, the largest ever demonstration in Britain's history against the war in Iraq. Part and parcel of the Socialist Workers' Party vanguard of this anti-war movement is a geopolitical perspective and representation of the barbarous heavyweights of imperialism and capitalism, producing and struggling with the provoked reactions of the counter underweights of anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism. A statement by the Socialist Workers' Party Central Committee, released the day after 9/11, asks, "Is it so surprising that some group, in rage and desperation at American policies around the world, should have chosen to turn its own methods against the U.S. itself? Yesterday's attacks were in fact a stark revelation of the nature of global capitalism. Our rulers believed that they could preside over a world heaving poverty, suffering, and injustice, and yet insulate their own metropolises from the consequences. The folly of this belief was exposed as the southern tip of Manhattan disappeared amid smoke and flames." End quote. Socialist Workers' Party Central Committee, 2001. A similar statement released 4 days after 7/7 questions: "How could, quote, 4 ordinary young men from Yorkshire be driven to blow themselves up in London? For Blair and Bush, they are barbarians, or were barbarians, at war with our, quote, our civilization," end quote. The answer? They had witnessed the real barbarity of the U.S., British, and Israeli imperialism. Quote, "So like the rest of us, they will have raged, but they will also have despaired. Then they succumbed, like other desperate young people on every continent at different times over the last 150 years, to the disastrous fantasy that they could rid the world of violence by hurling back a portion of violence in some act aimed at innocent people." Both statements evade condemnation of the attacks by posing them as tactically misguided venting of otherwise explicable and legitimate anti-imperialist anger, i.e., as simply products of imperialism and capitalism. Critically, then, the Socialist Workers' Party circumvent any deeper examination of the politics that the attacks were a continuation of, including the implications for progressive democratic working class forces. During the War on Terror, the Socialist Workers' Party's inverted dual camp of imperialist Goliath versus anti-imperialist David has gone further than refusing to condemn Islamist attacks in the West by offering political support to Islamist, quote, resistance to imperialism, end quote, in the Middle East. In particular, to the Iraqi insurgents, of which the rival Sunni and Shia Islamists have formed the dominant political components. Lebanon's Hezbollah and Palestine's Hamas. Their rationale: such resistance should be politically supported because it is an enemy to imperialism, has a base of popular support, wields power, and has elements of a political program that are agreeable. So, the Socialist Workers' Party advance, since socialists at home must hold out a, quote, uncompromising opposition to our own imperialist bourgeoisies, end quote, we ought to be politically lenient on the resistance, in whatever form, against our imperialist powers overseas. Accordingly, quote, sometimes terrorist attacks do more or less merge with the mass resistances of people, and this certainly affects or should affect the language and tone of our critique. We on the left should not, I suggest, condemn Palestinian suicide bombers or attacks by the Iraqi resistance, end quote. I think that's Mali New. Underpinning this is the calculation that by upsetting the global imbalance of forces, one's prime enemy will be destabilized and the left at home fortified. And an article aptly titled, quote, Why Opposing Imperialism Means Supporting Resistance, end quote, Chris Harman refers to how the momentum of Vietnamese struggle against U.S. imperialism in the 1960s infused the women's and black movements in the United States in order to make the case that political support for the Iraqi insurgents can in the long term yield a destabilization of imperialism over there and an advancement of the anti-war and anti-capitalist movement over here. This calculation is, quote, despite, Harman admits, quote, the attitude to women of some of the resistance groups and those whose religious bigotry leads them to direct their fire against other Iraqis as much as against the occupying troops, end quote. Leading Socialist Workers' Party theoreticians, Rees, Harman, Kalinikos, interpret Lenin's and Bukharin's classical accounts of imperialism as explaining the nature of imperialism today. This is understood as the synthesis of geopolitical rivalry between states and economic competition between capitals. Their analysis proceeds that leading the game in this classic contemporary inter-imperialist rivalry has been the grandstand of the Bush administration to uphold U.S. geopolitical superiority and impose an Anglo-American model of free market capitalism worldwide. Kalinikos, 2002. It is the economic vulnerability of the United States, brought about by ever-increasing internationalization of finance, investment, production, and trade, that in the interest of its multinationals has to be redressed by military might. And the, quote, blowback of 9/11 has offered greater opportunity for the world's, quote, rogue superpower, end quote, to unilaterally go, quote, on the rampage, end quote, Kalinikos. With the war in Iraq demonstrating the application of U.S. military power to ward off inter-imperialist rivalry and secure control of oil. An anti-imperialism, Harman conceptually anti-imperialism, Harman in 2003 conceptually conflates present-day Islamist resistance in the Middle East with past anti-colonial movements, thus positing such resistance as part of wider national liberation struggles against present-day colonial-style imperialism. In doing so, the critique of Islamism is limited to that of a critique of bourgeois democratic liberation movements more generally, which, while spurring people to, quote, confront local ruling classes that are tied to imperialism, end quote, giving, quote, rise to near-revolutionary upsurges, end quote, at worst, quote, misdirect those involved in a reformist direction, end quote. Therefore, for example, the Socialist Workers' Party insists that socialist support for the, quote, genuine national liberation movement, end quote, resistance against imperialist occupation in Iraq should not be altered by either its, quote, lack of single organization, end quote, or, quote, the insurgency's Islamist coloring, end quote. Alexander and Asaf, 2005. Further still, Rees argues that the decisions on, quote, whether or not to impose imperialism, end quote, cannot simply be based on, quote, whether or not we find the past or present behavior of the opposing regime to be progressive, end quote. Instead, it is, quote, determined by the totality of relations in the system at any one point, end quote. Oddly, the very fact that socialists oppose imperialism appears to be brought into question here. But what he is actually suggesting is that, in the global imbalance of forces, we need to side with the counter underweight against the heavyweight, and in the process, we need not concern ourselves with the politics flowing from the counter/underweight. Quote, this does not matter much for those of us who are active in the West building international activity against imperialism and war. We are on the side of third world movements against imperialism, however confused their ideas may be, but is of fundamental importance for third world revolutionaries. End quote, Harman, 2003. Over here, the Socialist Workers' Party theoreticians conclude, we need to concentrate on the defeat of our own imperialist governments, which means being firmly on the side of movements against imperialism over there. And it is the problem of socialists over there to contend with the more reactionary or reformist elements of the movement that we over here resolutely support. In brief, the duty of socialists to help build the third camp during the War on Terror is thwarted by an invasion of actual political content. And by a substitution of international workers' solidarity for a commitment to boost the resisting underdog afar, and in turn the anti-war and anti-imperialist movement back home. Fatalist prostration and the evasion of politics. Quote, support for a movement for liberation should not depend on those who lead it at a particular point in time. End quote. Harman, Socialist Workers' Party, 2006. Quote, an anti-imperialism based on the repression of women, religious minorities, small nationalities, trade unions, peasant organizations, and political parties actually performs a function imperialism wants: repression of the masses. The anti-imperialism of these religious forces thus actually serves imperialism in the current global scenario. It is the anti-imperialism of fools, end quote. Sulairia, Labour Party of Pakistan, 2006. Post 9/11, the Socialist Workers' Party has set itself the task of radicalizing the anti-capitalist milieu into a particular kind of anti-war and ultimately, quote, anti-imperialist movement, mobilizing, quote, politically diverse forces around a limited common objective, end quote, and ensuring party comrades are, quote, as militant as possible, end quote. They conclude that the success of the Stop the War coalition is due to the execution of a broad united front. Reminiscent, in fact, of the Stalinist Popular Front, in which the party poses as the, quote, champion of unity at all costs and the arch enemy of divisive, in quotes, debate, end quote, while siphoning recruits, quote, by virtue of organizational weight and prestige, end quote. Thomas, 2001. This broad united front is defined as, quote, unity of the basis of opposition to war alone, without the addition of other planks, for example, condemnation of terrorism, that may exclude some important potential allies, and that imply that the main enemy is anyone but Western imperialism." End quote. Socialist Workers' Party Central Committee, 2001. This popular front enables the possibility to unite with virtually any self-declared anti-imperialist force, sentiment, or language because of a shared enemy. In other words, the politics of my enemy's enemy is my friend. Take, for example, the Socialist Workers' Party's Central Committee's instruction with regard Israel's invasion of Lebanon in the summer of 2006. Quote, "As socialists and internationalists, we see our main responsibility as rallying mass opposition in our own countries to this war. The internationalist and radical left must throw their weight into the balance to help secure a defeat for imperialism that can weaken the global tyranny of capital." End quote. Socialist Worker Party Central Committee, 2006. This, in practice, was spelt out in the prominent slogan on England's anti-war demonstrations at the time: "We are all Hezbollah. Boycott Israel." The Socialist Workers' Party claim elsewhere in the world, anti-war mobilizations have been hindered by a drive by some imprudent leftists to oppose imperialism and Islamism. Klenikos, Nineham, 2007, Ashman, 2003, Socialist Workers' Party Central Committee, 2001. This is condemned as a political abstentionism rooted in confusion, infecting both the anti-capitalist milieu and sections of the left over the question of Islamism. So while public intellectuals such as Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn are acclaimed for having stood firm in opposition to the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, others on the left are considered to have floundered. It is remarked, for instance, that attacks Susan George was, for a period of time, confused over the question of Islam, not Islamism, and foolishly doubted her own opposition to the bombing Afghanistan. Ashman, 2003. During the Israeli war in Lebanon, Harman, 2006, defines those on the left refusing to support the Islamist Hezbollah as adopting a, quote, neither nor stance. This resembles Salone's misdefinition of the third camp as a sophism of equidistance, or a point of political abstinence halfway between two enemies falsely considered equal in their political dangers. A convenient misdefinition, perhaps, for on the part of the Socialist Workers' Party, the priority of building the biggest counterweight anti-imperialist movement does not then need to confront what is abandoned in the process. In other words, domestic political support for Islamist, quote, resistance to imperialism afar deserts the actual and potential international basis of the third camp, including labor movement solidarity with political forces, as exemplified by the following statement in relation to the US and UK war in Iraq. Quote, "We are openly against the occupation, but we are not part of the armed resistance. We are distant from Islamic political groups that control the resistance. Their political program is linked to the conservative Iraqi tradition, and they are not interested in the improvement of people's life conditions. We struggle directly, together with other movements of workers, progressives, women, and students, to defend our rights and to establish a civil, lay, secular society." End quote. Union of the Unemployed in Iraq, in Longhi, 2004. Quote, Is it the case that we have to struggle against, quote, is it the case that we have to struggle against political Islamic groups? They have already declared their hostile policy and practices against civil life and modernity, and in particular against women, by forcing women to wear veils, and by openly propagating their intention to bring back Sharia law. Do we have to struggle against another international reactionary force that has occupied Iraq? They have installed the so-called ruling council against the will of the people. The only way is to get organized and to struggle against all the reactionary forces and not allow them to rule us, end quote. Mahmoud, Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq, 2003. The general ramifications of the Socialist Workers' Party's post 9/11 anti-war politics, in quotations, is that treating politically retrogressive acts as simply products of capitalism or an imperialist regime effectively means substituting vigorous Marxist theory for a, quote, fatalist prostration, end quote, that evades politics. Trotsky, 1934. Which necessitates identifying with what products of capitalism to base ourselves on, which necessitates identifying what products of capitalism to base ourselves on in their conflict with what others. On this matter, Trotsky's debate with the ideas propagated in Le Humanité, the former daily newspaper of the French Communist Party, the PCF, on the question of workers' defense against the fascists is worth briefly revisiting. During 1934, the Humanité challenged the use of the workers' militias in defense against the fascists. One of the reasons that was given that in responding to the gunshots of the fascists with their own gunshots, quote, we lost sight of the fact that fascism is the product of the capitalist regime, and that in fighting against fascism, it is the entire system that we face, end quote. Trotsky astutely replies, quote, it is difficult to accumulate in a few lines greater confusion or more errors. It is impossible to defend oneself against the fascists because the fascists are, quote, a product of the capitalist regime, end quote. That means we have to renounce the whole struggle, for all contemporary social evils are, quote, products of the capitalist system. So, in a comparative twist with Le Humanité on fascism, when suicide bombers wound and kill ordinary workers in New York, London, or Iraq, one suspects the Socialist Workers' Party are close to alluding that we, quote, are to sigh philosophically, alas, murderers are products of the capitalist system, and go home with easy consciences, end quote. Trotsky, 1934. I'm going to repeat that because I'm confused for what I said. So in a comparative twist with La Humanité on fascism, when suicide bombers wound and kill ordinary workers in New York, London, or Iraq, one suspects that Socialist Workers' Party are close to alluding that we are, quote, to sigh philosophically, alas, murderers are products of the capitalist system, and go home with easy consciences, end quote. Trotsky, 1934. What is more, Harman's 1994 insistence that socialists must not regard Islamists as, quote, our prime enemies, end quote, because, quote, Islamists are not responsible for the system of international capitalism, end quote, are instead international capitalism's products, has post 9/11 gone one stage further, with the Socialist Workers' Party putting into effect Harman's argument that their, quote, feeling of revolt can, quote, be tapped for progressive purposes, end quote, So, quote, on some issues, we will find ourselves on the same side against imperialism and the state, end quote. Alas, once more, a revolutionary socialist commitment to equality is translated into a gamble to boost strategically weaker enemies to bring them on par with strategically stronger enemies. Thomas, 2002. What the Socialist Workers' Party schema misses is that while the growth of Islamism is a product of capitalism, quote, the increase in the misery and the revolt of the proletariat are also products of capitalism, end quote. Trotsky, 1934. And socialists have a duty to choose what products of capitalism to base ourselves on. Most obviously, the working class, and to politically develop these products as part of a third camp in their/our struggle against other products of capitalism which are detrimental to our ultimate emancipation. Perhaps the Socialist Workers' Party will retort, echoing La Humanité, that it is the whole capitalist system we have to deal with. But, quote, how? Echoing Trotsky. Over the heads of human beings? End quote. Trotsky, 1934. Conclusion. Let me get a water sip. Finish out strong, you know. Quote, in times of war, the frontiers will be altered. Military victories and defeats will alternate with each other. Jesus Christ. Quote. Fuck. All right. Let's get into character. We're just getting into character. Quote, in times of war, the frontiers will be altered. Military victories and defeats will alternate with each other. Political regimes will shift. Workers will be able to profit to the full from this monstrous chaos only if workers occupy themselves, not by acting as supervisors of the historical process, but by engaging in the class struggle. Only the growth of their international offensive will put an end not alone to episodic dangers, but also to their main source, class society. End quote. Trotsky, 1939. The account offered by this paper is that of a revolutionary socialist organization which heads an anti-war movement in the West during the proclaimed War on Terror, with a precarious, politically compromised perspective of the inverted dual camp, a flipping inside out of bourgeois promotions of worldwide conflicts as battles between the status quo and regression, into socialistic representations of battles between David and Goliath. In the process of prioritizing one enemy to be defeated, a systematic examination of what politics flow from David and Goliath, and specifically the corollaries thereof, for the development of an international sovereign offensive of the working class, is bypassed. Instead, it is deduced that by throwing one's weight behind David, the imbalance of forces can be turned against the prime enemy of Goliath. Critical geographers should recognize the anti-war, quote, politics of the UK-based Socialist Workers' Party is part of a wider political malady infecting the left, including parts of critical academia. A symptom of this malady is a gut anti-imperialism, which tempts leftists in the West, wishing the defeat of the usual imperialist suspects abroad, aka the United States, Britain, and Israel, to instinctively give political support to an opposing side. In its place, a third camp anti-war resistance needs to be advanced. This anti-war resistance can be strengthened by labor movements in the West, including our own academic trade unions, fully engaging in international political solidarity work with forces that occupy the front line and third front of workers' and oppressed people's struggles against imperialism and its reactionary enemies, and for progressive, democratic, secular alternatives. Within and beyond Marxist, autonomist, and post-Marxist critical geography, this paper calls for a return to the very spirit of vital guiding principles of Marxism. This requires reopenings of and debates on original Marxist ideas and practices that have been prematurely assumed defunct. In sum, the bourgeois dual camp and the bourgeois dual camp's leftist inversion reduce socialists to geopolitical gamblers who hedge bets on a return that might generate the most anti-imperialist conditions, and reduce workers to mere supervisors of history, bankrupt of any agency to steer and change its course. Third camp Marxism stipulates independent working class politics as a fundamental prerequisite for the survival of humanity. While the International Third Front is not at present anywhere near to being a fully fledged force, its dialectical foundations are nevertheless in existence, everywhere, and the political task of advancing these is, this paper suggests, one worth fighting for.